Rob Sanchez. I'm not sure that's really me. Hi, I'm glad to see all of you. Today I'm going to be more generating what I'm talking about than really giving a speech, mainly because I was up last night with my 7-month-old son, and as I was playing with him, I had kind of a realization that the presentation I was going to give, number one, it was a little bit too far down the rabbit hole, and number two, it was very complex, and I figured that there was something else that would be a little bit better based on reading him books at a level of fatigue that was something along the lines of, this is a cat is interesting, this is a dog is interesting. But it really got me thinking about the ABCs and simplicity. So with that being said, a quick little bit about me. So CEO of Mouthmedia Network, and I teach entrepreneurial law at Florida. What Mouthmedia Network is a business development focused podcast network. We're number one in the world of what we do, and what we do is make sure that business is coming from the conversations on podcasts, not just from advertising against them. We have 14 shows. As you can see, a lot of them are top in their categories, and that's primarily because of who is listening to us, and not because of our audience size. Our shows range from 500 people listening to around 15 to 20,000 listening on a weekly basis. But what's important is that on our shows, the people that are listening are the people who are driving those industries. Our focus is on the room for the network. And we have two purposes. One is to make sure that our hosts, all of whom come from the industries that we cover, that they have a reason to be there. We don't compensate our hosts. In fact, many of them pay us to have those shows. And what they're getting is the ability to connect directly with very targeted people inside of their industries and build their credibility and build their ability to have conversations that otherwise they'd have no access to. In addition to that, we have a division that's doing, I guess you would call it internal podcasts at major corporations, so enterprise level sales. And there our target is conversations that activate specific things inside of those companies. So a sales team of 20 to 50 people having a podcast that is directly for that group, that is teaching them and training them exactly what they need. And what we're looking at there is fundamental changes to the performance of that organization. And a little bit about podcasts, because I think that it's very important to have a flavor of the industry. I'm not one for putting a lot of information on the slides, so hopefully you can catch from the conversation what you need to know and then talk with me afterwards if you want more specifics. A quarter of the US population listened to a podcast in the last month. 17% of those listen on a weekly basis. And what's really interesting about podcast listeners is that their engagement with the world is different than most other people. They are primarily using audio as the way of getting information. And if you are an engaged podcast listener, you're not just listening to your podcast, you're actually consuming audio content in multiple different platforms and multiple different places, but very intentionally. You have your favorite music player, you have your favorite podcast player, and you have the place you go for audio-related news. And you probably also listen to the radio. 46% of people who are avid podcast listeners are listening and getting their news primarily from audio, regardless of whether it's on the podcast or not. And then we've been doing more research as an industry. It used to be that we talked about how this is on the commute, on your way to work, and so on. What it's turning out is that most of the listening is actually happening at home before the commute, and it's happening in the morning, and it's usually being consumed by people who are using it to inform them for their day. A couple other things is that podcast listeners tend to be deeply engaged. Admission intentional listeners, they tend to be rather fans about what they're listening to, and there's so much content out there that the person is choosing that person. And discovery is terrible. we've been approached by several major networks about testing ideas for TV shows. You can't do that with a podcast because you can't discover content. So your marketing lift is actually higher to develop a podcast audience than to develop a hit TV show. What that means though, or what you do get with a podcast is retention and engagement and evangelism. And so what we were discussing with that network is to flip their thinking. You want Walking Dead followed by Talking Dead. You don't want to test Talking Dead to develop Walking Dead. And so the medium is all about engagement, evangelism, and connection. So with that framework, just a little bit about what, after last night, I now see as the ABCs of podcasting. So there are 3 flavors of podcast, 3 different ways to use it. There's using it for authority, using it for business, and using it for communication. And podcasting is not an easy solution to a marketing problem. It is a tool with very specific use cases that you need to be thinking about before you develop it. It takes at least 9 months to have a podcast that has its legs, and it takes at least 3 years to have a podcast that's running smoothly. It is a slow growth medium that requires a tremendous time investment and often monetary investment as well. So what's really important is focusing on the why you're doing the podcast and what is the reason that the conversation must exist. And it's that must that trips a lot of people up. It's not because you want to share your idea with the world. There has to be a bigger why behind it. So starting with the idea of authority. When we're thinking about authority in podcasts, what we're thinking about is podcasts that are about a brand or podcasts that are about a person. So this is me interviewing Marcy Allen. She was named by Billboard Top 100 as one of the best, I guess, agents for musicians in the world. She had just closed a deal with Urban Outfitters with the rapper Taylor Bennett. Taylor is the brother of Chance the Rapper, which is a really terrible way to be introduced, but that's probably how you all have context for who he is. He partnered with Urban Outfitters as part of Pride Week. He is the first major hip-hop recording artist to be openly bisexual. And he joined us on stage and did a freestyle set after Marcy spoke. I shouldn't have access to that. I shouldn't be a part of that conversation, but I had a platform, and I could get Marcy in the room, and it raises my credibility. And so when you're thinking about yourself, when you're thinking about authority, a podcast is very useful in giving you the venue, the platform, the microphone, and the control of conversations that raise your level of credibility. People want to tell their stories. If you give them a safe, welcoming space to do that, you become part of their story, and you become part of the growth of what they're doing. In addition to that, there are a lot of formats you can use in a podcast that may be expensive or difficult logistically in other mediums. Inside of the podcast it's a simple setup. It's 2 mics, 3 mics, 4 mics, however many you need. You can even do an ambient mic if you want to spend the rest of your life editing. And it's all about controlling the conversation, not necessarily controlling the environment when you're doing a podcast that's about getting your voice or your brand out there. So what you can start to look at is, do I want myself to be credible, in which case I want a fireside chat or a monologue format. You can start to think about how to use that channel in the same way that people have started doing these one-off books. This is my book about how 8 ways to sell a car or something like that, and then you self-publish it and you send it out. You can do something similar with a podcast where you're sharing your thoughts. On the first slide, there is a show called Word of Mouth. That is my credibility driver in the audio space. And through that show, I have access to everyone from Spotify to AdvertiseCast to Megaphone, who are major players in the space. And it's helping me prove that I know what I'm talking about, because you hear me talking about it every single week. By the way, going back to the time investment and so on, if you don't have the time and resources to do a weekly show, you shouldn't do a podcast unless you're doing a short mini season. People do not have their listening behaviors are such that they don't have time to test a lot of content. They tend to choose something and stick with it. So if you miss a week, if you miss 2 weeks, if you miss 3 weeks, you've lost your entire audience and you're starting over. We actually had one show lose 45% of its audience over a 2-week holiday period, and it still is underperforming. It was our largest show. It dropped from 25,000 to 15,000, and it's been very slow building that back up. So going back to authority, if you're doing panels, if you're doing news, if you're doing tips, what you need to find is what's going to resonate with your audience and how is it going to build the authority around what you're talking about. By the way, can everybody hear me in the room? One time? Okay. So if you're doing a tip show, this is a behavior that's starting to be driven, which is smart speaker adoption. Podcast listeners are 2.5 times more likely to have an in-home speaker, and they're starting to be trained that when you start your day, you want to start it with a news briefing. You want to start it with makeup tips. You want to start it, whatever it is in your lifestyle that's necessary in the morning, it comes from talking to Alexa. So you now can build and release podcasts that are about 5-minute tips in the morning. It's start your day with a news briefing for your industry, and so on. And that also, if you're that trusted source of news, all you're really doing is often reading the headlines and maybe adding 1 or 2 things on top of it, or accumulating knowledge across the year and releasing it on the schedule. But that's going to help you be that touch point that person goes to every day. So then when you engage with them later on, you are that trusted authority. And then along with authority, there's 2 aspects of podcasts that we do that are slightly different than what other people do. First is sort of a general concept of podcasting, which is that the best way to get your show heard about is to have another podcaster talk about it. And the reason for that is that the discovery in the industry is so broken that you're more likely to find out about content from sitting next to somebody in a bar than you are from a recommendation inside of the podcast app. So if you think about that for a moment, that's a pretty huge problem. But also, it means that there's an opportunity that's untapped. The share of mind space between podcasters is very important. And so if you start to drive intentionally towards partnerships with people, and you can ride on each other's authority and amplify each other's voices, and that helps you grow. The other thing is that a podcast activation in a live event is another incredibly powerful thing. It puts the right people in the room, which I'll talk about in the B section. But it also gives you, these people came, they're listening to you, and they're going to talk about the podcast as well. And so on the authority side, using those partnerships and those live events is really going to drive that attention and that engagement with the content beyond just hoping that people listen. The other interesting thing about podcasting is that the conversion rate from social media to podcasting, we had 1 live recording with 9 million impressions, and we picked up about 100 new listeners. So if you think about that conversion rate, that's crazy. It really is, it has to be a conversation, an experience, and then a conversion from that to listenership. So going to business, this is us at a conference. Sid Jatiet is in the middle, and Lisa Marie Remus is on the right. Sid is the head of digital for Under Armour, and Lisa Marie runs 24/7, which is a recruiting firm that is specializing in and moving into digital marketing, sales, and placing people in digital marketing roles at major corporations. 24/7 paid us to be a host on our long-running show so that she could sit next to Sid for 45 minutes, and they left us friends and they closed business with Under Armour after that. So using a podcast for business is a very intentional act, and what it means is that you're shifting your focus. So your focus on authority is who's your audience, how do you reach them, how do you grow that? Your focus with business is how do I convert? And you care about who's in the room, not who's in the audience. And so what we found is that you can design rooms to lead to better business outcomes. You want people to come in and be friends with you when they leave. So we do very subtle things like Our studio is set up as a living room, not as a recording studio. You are sitting in armchairs around the circle, and it feels like everybody's closer together. In addition to that, we require that everybody who comes on mic brings us food, because there's nothing like an act of service to somebody to put you on their level. So by requiring, it doesn't matter what you're the CEO of, you bring us food. That's because you're part of us now, and you've served us, and that relationship fundamentally shifts in that moment. You leave as a friend, and you don't have to worry about, is this guy going to take my call afterwards when I go to sell him something? With a focus on business, your intention changes. You want to make sure that the conversations you have are still hitting your audience. But I'll be honest, we were surprised when we hit top in the world. That wasn't intentional. We didn't market the shows. We didn't talk about it really on social media. We had one Twitter account, one Instagram account, and we posted occasionally on LinkedIn. We hit top in the world because the people we had on mic loved the experience so much that they told other people to go be on mic with us. And we spread that way over about a year and a half and hit top in the world with the show. And we actually outperformed Vogue and people like that with massive audiences for two reasons. We're intentional about our hosts, and we're intentional about our guests. So Vogue hired Andre Leontali. He's a great personality, but doesn't know that much, and he's about Andre Leontali. And so some people listen to that, and some people are really engaged with it, but it's not the people that we care about. What we did that was different was we hired CEOs. And we had our CEOs talk to other CEOs about their industries and what they were passionate about. And that intentionality for us, we recently switched from a sponsorship model to focusing on the third segment, communication. And our network is now driving lead gen for this new product that we've been testing and releasing with major corporations, which is that podcast for communication, where the focus is on fundamental transformation of the team, a small team, and very targeted. So on that side, what we're really good at is designing conversation arcs for business content and then coaching people in audio situations. And this guy here, whose name is John Domenico, is the #1 Trump impersonator in the world. And John is also a character actor. You've probably seen him in things. And what he does is conversations with corporations. This, by the way, is our studio. John does conversations with corporations that are about shifting and bringing humor to their internal communications. So what we do is work with the corporation and say, I have to do this. I have to get this point across. And then we bring in experts, or we work with them to train their people to have the conversations so that those 10 or 15 people in that sales group hear about what's happening. And so this is kind of that next level of the podcast, which is, it's a podcast for you, not a podcast for you. And it's really taking advantage of specificity, but with very clear KPIs to it. We want to increase sales by 40%. In the case of our partnership with a major international beauty brand, we were training 50 people in an internal sales role who were dealing with the question of, now that there are malls in the Midwest, how do we sell makeup as a wholesale sales rep? That's a huge question. And what we did was brought in the experts they needed to train them on that. So really quick, 3 flavors. Know what you are and what your goals are. Is it about authority? Is it about business development, or is it about communication with a very specific KPI? And that's going to let you design the content in a way that gets you to where you need to be, and that justifies the effort and expense that goes into creating a podcast. Going a little bit further, so for us, what we do now is we sell in authority and business. We'll create a podcast for you and help you design it around what you want. And on the communication side, we work with and train the corporations to have conversations they want. if you're interested in working with us and seeing what that looks like, we're doing a special. We do a full show. We do all this design, audio, landscape, everything else around it. And you get 4 episodes released on a site for that show, as well as released through a general channel called Mouthmedia Studio. If you want to do that, it's a $5,000 purchase. If you purchase by Sunday, it becomes $3,500. On the communication side, there's 2 flavors to this. If you are a coach, if you are training other people, or if you're selling into a client who's a corporation, we do the packaging differently. It's $9,000, and we take a revenue right on whatever revenue you earn from that. And if instead you're doing it, you're the corporation who wants the training, it's $25,000, and we'll discount to $12,000 if you come in on Sunday. So if you have questions, come and talk with me about how to make podcasts work for you. And Lee, also in the back, is our head of sales, so you can speak with either of us. Thank you.